that said, I'm gonna share that good old screen. Actually, have visuals, so visuals make things a little more substantial. Had enough time this week to pull that off. So slideshow time. All right, cool. Does everybody see my screen? Just want to make sure we got clear copacetic on that. All right, good. All right, cool. So AI tools to help with better reading. So let's, oh, I gotta click it. Okay. So obviously this is a conversation about reading, but I think an important thing to give context a step back in all my research on reading has been that reading has kind of correspondent activities to go with it. So when we do reading, we have writing in correspondence with it. And actually both of those from a historical development point of view go backwards into listening and speaking. So generally when we say we're teaching people to read and write, we're also teaching them how to speak and listen. So reading, writing, speaking, and listening kind of all correspond with each other. Because fundamentally, these processes or episodes or activities of encoding information or decoding information. When we speak or write, we're encoding information. And when we're listening or reading, we're decoding. And generally, we started with listening and speaking is because when there was actual individuals in front of each other, there would be a speaker and listener in a correspondence with each other in a particular time and place. But obviously, the main distinction between speaking and reading, speaking and writing, in this case, we have a writer basically producing an external artifact, a piece of text, which is then read by a reader at an independent time, potentially. So obviously the first examples historically were cuneiform, which was originally used for accounting. So as this active, so we think of writing as externalization of cognition of the mind. This started as a very early technology. So the first examples were just accounting of sheep or wheat, for example, in Sumeria, for example. But eventually moving from just a simple numbering counting procedure, just counting how many bundles of wheat were given to the taxes for that year. Eventually, the writing system cuneiform was developed into a linguistic structure that allowed communication of language explicitly. This is the Coda Hammurabi, for example, communicating the legal mandates in that jurisdiction. And then obviously, it doesn't go much for progression from there to go into things like Trajan's column, for example, which is a monumental architectural piece from the early empire of Rome, where they're claiming it's basically a monument of the triumph of Trajan when he conquered Damascus. And then from these developments, we went to that to read to manuscript writing in terms of scrolls and into communicating using ink and paper. So we went from a kind of hard rock material to externalized accounting or official declarations or memoriams of victories to then correspondence of communication on a much more intimate personal level with a smaller scale, right? Because paper is obviously a lot lighter and a lot smaller than granite stone. But the basic premise is that, and is also to remember that reading and writing with speaking and listening were in very deep correspondence with each other for a very long period of time. Generally, if you notice, if I actually go back in the examples, even this example with Latin, if you notice, there's a lack of upper and lowercase, lack of punctuation, and lack of word space. The expectation is when you were reading, these were just basically signposts to the words meant to be said. So the idea was when someone was literate, they would see this as almost as music notation and then know where the words were broken and speak those out in a spoken way. It was not meant to be a private communication or private kind of thinking, reading silently in your head. That comes much later. Augustine speaks about that around. I'm going to think around. I remember the time period. I believe around 800. When was Augustine writing? My mind blanked. But basically, the idea was that reading and writing, this idea of externalized cognition, we have a long history of it in human civilization, and it progressively went from a monumental, large-scale architectural objects to then much more to private, intimate relationships of communication. And especially when it became external print in a community of exchange, dramatic effects occur. So, for example, music notation in 1100 AD allowed for rapid development and learning of music hymns in religious context. So the story from Guido of Arezzo speaks about what used to take years of training choir men to sing songs, to know the songs of the church, to learn that within 1 year. Excuse me, 1 month actually. So from years to 1 month, just because of the power of notation, of documenting sound notes and how those correspond to words. Likewise, in mathematics, the operation, first of all, just even the idea of notation of the zero, the idea of placeholder as zero was not only a conceptual innovation in mathematics, but allowed for, as we develop mathematical notation, much more sophisticated thought about math, from simple counting cardinal numbers, for example, let alone things like the newspaper. So the activity of mass production of print within a distribution within the community at a very regular periodical time cycle allowed for things, for example, in 1645 and 1700s, the Enlightenment period, generally where ideas and thought within a larger community were allowed to be communicated, versus either, as we saw in the very ancient mode, very monumental stone architectural lettering communication, to very expensive books made out of linen, for example. Very expensive linen paper, for example. So generally, we see the development as writing, as externalized thought has been made material and expanded a larger distribution of networks. We've had generally a correspondence between the act of writing with reading by author to an audience, and that reader basically converting it by either listening to it being said to them, or by knowing reading literacy, being able to convert that sound in their head to the words, and then basically gaining understanding that way. But what about the bridge connection between speaking and writing and listening and reading? Well, generally, a lot of technology innovations have been mostly focused on bridging the sideway gaps. So, for example, speech to text converts my speaking out loud to a transcription of text, for example, and text to speech does the opposite. It converts a piece of text to speech. So they do this correspondence, if you notice, kind of laterally in this diagram. So from speaking to writing, or from reading to listening, we're able to kind of bypass certain activities. It's not introducing anything new per se, but kind of removing some of the frictions in these interactions of information. But the key thing then pick up is that it's not necessarily this connection top down of reading and writing and speaking and listening. And this is relevant because there is a very big difference between information reproduction and knowledge generation. And some examples from just contemporary literacy studies. This is from basically a major organization in the United States that studies literacy results in the United States. So this section I just highlighted is the demonstration. These are individuals who do not read at a proficient level. So what this means is that these are individuals that, I believe this is, remember correctly, 12th grade, that, or when you give them a piece of text, could not read that text and give you an information about something said inside it. So for example, if the text said, Sally bought 5 apples from the store, Mr. Jenner's, how many apples did Sally buy? That would be an example of when we're asking for reading proficiency, being that if you were able to read that piece of passage of text and answer that question, you'll be proficient. As you can see here, well over 50% of students are not able to achieve that requirement. Now, proficient means what I just said, right? This idea of if a text said, if you have explicitly answered in the text, you are able to recall it back. So this is information regeneration. This is just recall, the ability that something's already given and then you just recall it back. But in the small number, what's called the advanced status, this is a very small percentage. These are people that are able to take multiple pieces of text and to make an inference from that. So let's say there's 2 pieces of text. One is Sally bought 5 apples from Mr. Jenner's store on Monday. I'm trying to give an example that makes sense in this context. And then and then another piece of passage said, Mr. Jenner sold the apples for $4. If you're asked the question, how much did Sally pay for the apples? You would have to read both pieces of text and then make an inference to answer the question. So this very small percentage, and very steadily small percentage of students who are able to make inferential generation. So they're not able, so it's not just repeating, regurgitating, recalling information presented to them by a stimulus, but instead taking that stimulus information and generating a new understanding from it. It's a very small percentage. And partly, by the way, this is not, and as you can see in the slide deck, this goes to 1992, but Mordred Adler, who's famous for the great book series, the canonical book series from the University of Chicago, he wrote a book on how to read a book. He was commenting in the 1950s, the idea that we were building, children or our students are failing how to read. They don't know how to read. So this is not a new issue. And fundamentally is what I just said, this idea of advanced literacy, of being able to do inferential power of insight that is lacking. And what he's generally saying, what he's getting at is the idea of active reading to understand a text versus passive. So for example, when a reader engages with a book or a piece of text, the general literature, not just by Adler's arguments in the book, How to Read a Book, but also in research since then, education, you're most effective when you are directing your reading by questioning, by asking a question. And this is so significant because the idea without having questions to answer, there's a large propensity of the illusion of knowledge. So the idea is just because you read a book, if you have no way, if there's no checking on your knowledge, either by answering of questions or summarizing or retelling that book, what was important about it, what was significant to you, to someone else, you might have the impression or an illusion that you have knowledge of the book. I'm guilty of that too. I've read books, especially things like audiobooks, where you're in a more passive state. You're not actively paying attention because you're listening to the text. If I was asked, what would you learn from that book? I might give you maybe 1 or 2 points about it at best. I've noticed I've caught myself when that's happened. I would have the illusion of having understanding of the text, but I actually didn't because I never did anything actively to double check my understanding. So the main distinction, first of all, about what seems to be the case, why there's this huge imbalance between advanced literacy, the proficient, and everyone who's not, is this dichotomy of active and passive reading. And by the way, it doesn't just go with active reading. It's also remember the main idea brought up by Adler and also others is the idea is when you're engaging with a text, you're asking questions like, what's the structure of the book? What are the important words in the book and how are those words used? And how does this book help me with some project or concern I have right now? Is that all these things need to be done in an interfacing of reading and writing. So one of the major things, and actually the main thing they say is things that might seem like active reading, like underlining or highlighting, or actually not good enough. You actually what needs to be done is things like basically having a passage of text on the outside to answer these questions in your own words, not just verbatim repeating what the text says, for example. But beyond even just reading one text, what Adler is advising in his book, in terms of how to read in literature since then, is what's called synoptic reading. So reading on multiple pieces of sourcing about questions or concerns of you as a reader. And one of the exemplars of this kind of reading and actually writing or authoring is St. Thomas Aquinas with the Summa Theologica. So here's like one example from the website edition of it. If we notice here, we see a question asked, then we see a listing of objections by a hypothetical speaker. And then there's a quotation of on contrary, and then our answer. So what's happened here is in the objections, as well as the reply, there is quoting of 4 different texts. We have Pseudo-Dionysius, we have the Proverbs, we have Aristotle, we have Exodus, all being quoted inside the text. So that question from the beginning is then layered or kind of saw through a prism of all these different texts. And then a reply is generated through looking at that prism of the relationships of those different texts related together. But then what happens on the most highest level kind of reading, that's synoptic, of completely different domains of reading that intersect with each other to create innovative new understanding. So here's an example. What would be the relationship of some text in physics versus finance? In physics, they might have a text on fluid dynamics. And while in finance, they're talking about market dynamics. What would be a linkage between the two? Well, one of them is basically liquid dynamics, the mathematics for liquid interactions, apparently, that explain fluids in physics are also used to explain dynamics in markets. So using a metaphor of liquid, we can parse through these prisms of text of physics and finance to gain a new understanding. I mean, I'm not just making that up. This is not just me making a hypothetical. It's true. You can look up research documents that cite basically in the finance literature, they're using physics terminology and math and models and modes of discussion to understand markets. Basically, Brownian particle movement. That's be like one of the examples of it. And then here's another one. So the idea is that in the act of reading of diverse texts, there's a generation of new ideas possible. And this is done through it kind of, as you can see here, when we talk about effective reading, we have to notice here, we're not just dealing with just passivity. There's an activity that needs to be done here. So there's a kind of active state of reading with text needs to be engaged with. And to give you an example that's outside reading, I box, so I'm going to use an example. Here's the thing. If the essence of boxing is to hit and not be hit, the actual answers of the grammars, the kind of being literate in boxing is to know that essential point. And then the question of by knowing the grammar of boxing, there are many diverse ways to answer that question. So we have Mike Tyson's one example of that. We have Floyd Mayweather's another example of that. It's kind of amazing. Basically, the sequencing and timing. Muhammad Ali is another example of that. They're all literate in boxing. I'm being a little playful with this language of literacy, but by knowing this principle of boxing, it's just to hit and not be hit. They're incorporating completely divergent solutions to that problem. So they all interrelate. And as someone who's also a boxer, you're able to understand the kind of cross literature domain of all these different kinds of boxers interacting with each other and what they are doing to achieve this principle, this kind of essential quality of boxing. And ultimately, an answer come up, and that's the key thing, is not just a reproduction of a copying of what those boxers are doing, but they come up with your own answer to that question. And one of the examples might be, you might focus on footwork, you might focus on positioning. It's generally not, as a general thing, aside on boxing, it's generally not your fists that are deciding this question, how to hit and not be hit. The answers usually tend to be other things like footwork or position or timing that the feet are just a secondary property, the fists are a secondary property along the way. So to draw this out, when I keep saying about this active role of reading, here's an example. So I do an analog procedure, for example, where I'll have a reading session where I have a question I need to answer. So in this case, what's Aristotle's account of a word? And then on the following other side of the piece of paper is the answer. So I basically find a source, in this case, Interpretation, Book 1, Part 1, and I write out I basically summarize what Aristotle's answer was. And of course, naturally, there's going to be, when you answer something, there's always seems when you do this actively, there's going to be a natural question that follows your answer. So in this case, what's mental experience for Aristotle? That was one of the essential points of what is the word? The word's a capturing of a mental experience. So then I have to go hunt down that. And notice it's a completely different text. It's not on interpretation that you find the answer to that question. I had to go to On the Soul to find the answer, a possible answer by Aristotle on what is mental experience. And then the idea is by this kind of hunting, this kind of almost pursuit of like answering question, you can then generate basically it creates a sub-generating habit of answer question and basically finding these answers out and then drawing new questions from that. And then those kind of chain out into a complete network of relationships. And it isn't done in a very analog way, as you're seeing here. Yep. Can I click out? There we go. But so now draw is in, okay, what can AI do? So one of the things AI can do is while there are a lot of advantages of that paper method, the great reality is it's locked into one static form that exists. And yeah, it's cool. I have it bundled up in one packet. But then what about any other relationships I might want to see in other dynamics or other pieces of text? I can't do that on paper. So Napkin is a service that I've recently started using, and I actually quite love it. It works very well with this kind of paper method of question answer reading that I've been doing. So this is just me kind of now sharing through some ideas. So as we see here, we have these little very discrete pieces of packet of information that I type in. And as you can see here, every time I click, it's drawing out comparable similar phrasings or cards basically that might relate to it, usually by either keyword or by language I used. Um, and then also I could, let's see, oh, same thing again. Okay. And on this one. And then I can basically toggle through different cards. And you can see in the background, if you look very close in the background, those black squares, those kind of gray squares, those are bundlings of text. So then texts are basically getting centered, kind of masses of gravity that I can toggle through and get basically see relationships I may not have noticed before when I first wrote the text, for example. And then just like, I had these things stacked together as stacks, there's also a stack feature in Napkin that allows me to order my passages together. So it allows me to chain link all these points together into more coherent sentences, or basically get ready to start doing that. Because I could copy paste it, plug it in, and it flows through. It does have functionalities to allow for, especially if you have web links, you can put a web link in so you know where your citations are. So that's quite a useful trick too. So as you can tell, what Napkin's doing, it does everything my paper methodology of reading and writing is doing, but with some added interesting features that are AI based. So it allows me to basically automate the keyword searching capacity by generating the keywords for me, as well as finding links in the structures of my text that I may not notice. By the way, because the Napkin's a bootstrap project, I actually had to pay in to get access to it. I had to pay the membership straight up. The guys, and I like the guys who are working on it. They were very generous, and I told them I was speaking about their product. They offered us basically a promo link that if you use a promo link, you can basically get access to the tool for free for a month. So you get to try it out without paying for it. And then if you try it for a month, if you really enjoy using it, you can basically support their product, support them bootstrap that project. So that's just one example. So that's just one thing to give a heads up on. Okay, the other AI tool I've been messing with besides Napkin, which is more of a capturing device, like a capturing connection relationship product, is Pseudowrite. Pseudowrite was originally designed for screenwriters writing basically movies, scripts, and plays to help them with writer's block. So if you're stuck with a script, you don't know what to do with it, you use Pseudowrite to help use AI to guide your writing by different things. You can either suggest different things to write. It can basically, you can give it prompts to answer to. You have all these interesting functionalities. It's meant for screenwriters. It's not meant for us interested in philosophy or kind of conceptual thought. So I decided to have fun with it and hack around with it to see what you can do with it. So the first example, I actually maxed out my free trial, so I have to just kind of hack it along to show you guys. But for example, one thing you can do is you can typeset a piece and then have it rephrase it for you, either being more succinct, for example, be more explicit, and you can kind of see what did it say and what maybe is a way. I almost consider this as a riff partner. So as you write your text, you can riff off with Pseudowrite to see how would you how your phrases differently or more efficiently, for example. That'd be one idea. So as you can see here, I have this emphasis of the text I wrote. And then here's an example here where they give you suggestions or replies. So the pings you can think about. So beyond basically your rephrasing, you can also give you advice about how to expand your writing. So in this case, it's telling me, draw out what Aristotle means by Anageia more. So you said you brought it up, but you didn't explain it with examples. And look for other ways that it has been defined by other individuals. So this is more like basically like my English professor kind of reviewing my piece and trying to draw out more understanding from me. Yeah, and then there's another example of that too. And then he goes the other way. So instead of rewriting to draw it out or have drill out more examples, like, can you say more succinctly? So that's an example here. Gives you all these prompts to think about. So this was one way, but this is kind of still hands off away, kind of just treating this as kind of messing around to see what it does. How successful it was, it was a little touch and go a little bit. I think the main thing was actually it was funny. Sometimes I could see it like draw from basically because it's drawing from just this large corpus of text. And sometimes it goes in directions that are kind of like I see where I went, I know why he was doing that, but it was not where I wanted the writing to go or the idea to go. It wasn't my intention of it. So there was a little, I had to like course correct it to tell it where to go sometimes. The other way I tried to mess around with it was actually like, oh, let me pretend like it is a character. Let me put like characters in there and put ideas in their mouths and see how they respond. So here's an example. I had this one piece where I had this idea of like a boy and girl like having an awkward conversation, and they're about to have it looks like they'll probably have implying there's a breakup about to occur. They have a long history with each other, and then he makes a statement about something about the quality nature of lack. Uh, and then I had the AI try to reply, and one of these it does. Whoop, let's see if it. Yeah, it does. You can have it basically prompted to say what happens next. And then it gives you options like she can disagree with it, she can ignore you, and in this case, she agrees with him. So this is the one I chose. So she agrees with the prompt I gave for lack, and then this is the reply I gave. Then here's another example. I drew it out like as if I was pretending like as if I was speaking. I was the character was then the next day at a cafe with Aristotle speaking with him. So that was a fun little play. So it's like me basically making characters with ideas put implanted in them, and then seeing how those ideas play out in exchange and communication with each other. So that was a little fun. That was a little fun direction. How successful was it? It was a little, I think it was more just a fun exploration, I would say. So as I said, I think pseudo write's more of a riff partner to kind of play with ideas and see kind of where it goes. I had kind of mixed results with it, to be honest. Napkin, I thought was a slam dunk. I thought, at least because I do a very analog process, very similar to Napkin's architecture and structure. So I find Napkin very useful. Also, especially because you have functionalities like you can send tweets and online articles to it. By forcing you to have to summarize it, it does exactly the same, like this active reading procedure. And also because it stores it and then connects it to my other pieces of text. So I'm both using like physical textbooks like Aristotle and Aquinas and Hegel. So all those texts and Heidegger, all those texts, my interpretations and readings of those are in this database, but then they're intermixed with web stuff, like basically web articles and doctorate dissertations I'm reading and other bits and bobs. And it's fun to see sometimes how they intersect with each other. I think it's really rewarding and very insightful. That would allow for more basically kind of eruptions of insight that's possible. And by the way, this idea of the AI side, like what I'm talking about is a very limited scope of the possibilities. So as a colleague of mine, Paul, with his wife, Shema, they were exploring using AI generated art to create basically all this wardrobe presentations in a video format. So this is using the DALI 2 algorithm processor to render all these pieces of dress on Shema, the character here. Another example from Paul is the idea from movie scenes, basically inferencing out to the scenes basically of the movie set. Oh, and the main thing about this is that Paul was explaining that this is not some magic. It's not like that. I think the big thing is that the AI, I think a lot of people have assumptions that the AI is going to just replace human beings. I think it's only going to replace human beings when their job is just information recall. If your job is information recall or reproduction of known information already, then yeah, I think AI will absolutely replace, because that's what it basically does. Because like Paul was explaining in this demonstration walkthrough video of that scene. Whoop, excuse me, wrong one. There you go. Uh, there you go. And this one is that it can't just generate stuff out of nothing. You need to give it information. And it takes a lot of like basically directing it, saying, no, that's not it. That's not the right direction. It's very analogous to my relationship, how I was with pseudo write with me. Pseudo write couldn't just like make cool stuff for me and I didn't have to think anymore. Instead, I had to like, get in there and really course and like move it like a little child to go in the right direction, to think about things. So it's not like it's basically does a very good job of inferencing things that are already known, kind of filling in the gap. It's not very good at generating the first idea and especially evaluating it, that it's successful or not. These totally rely on human beings to do that. And by the way, even what DALL-E does in the first place. Oh, whoopsie daisy. I forgot to turn off the audio. Fun times. This is why it's a fun time. Okay. Can I pause? Yeah. The one thing I want to notice the way it works is that generally what these algorithms are doing in the visual forms like this, what they generally do is they take a source, they actually go into abstraction of noise, and then out of the noise regenerate from the prompt given to it to create a new source. So so it does is basically it needs information. It only exists within bounded space, and it can inference from there by going into basically noise, randomness, and then from the noise emerge out to another position on the known map space of information or presentation. So like I said, AI is doing basically AI's job in filling in gaps in mass understanding, like basically things that are culturally known, already established, and just you need to fill in a gap or just connect two things that are already known. AI does a fantastic job with that. I think that's a very useful tool. You can even do things like, so for example, the idea is like X and Y, and then find me something between the two, X and Y. It's just basically interpolating from two known vectors to something in between the two. Very straightforward. An algorithm can do that no problem. Even combinatory matching, mix and match, very easy. Now the numbers get gigantic, and it's still a problem of selection. Like you can make combinations. So for example, X, Y. Well, what happens if we combine X and Y? Sure. And then if you can, as they get more variables that you can combine together, the combinatory explosion that occurs only takes about 4 examples to get up to, I believe, like a couple 100,000 or took a couple thousand pair possibilities up to 4 if you have 4 variables, for example. So the example there is not even computers can do that combinatory combination mix and match, but which one is useful? Which one is actually of value versus another? That takes a human being to decide that question. But then lastly, generating a personal understanding. Now, this is something that AI cannot do. AI can basically, using tools like I think Napkin can help you gain this more effectively than not. But in general, an active mode of reading and writing would achieve this. But AI tools basically help you move forward in that procedure. And that because you have to direct it by the questions you're asking. That's basically what it all comes down to. So instead of basically technologies like speech to text or text to speech, those don't help you in any way with asking questions, directing your questions, or engaging with text to answer questions, let alone not just a single text, but then grouping multiple pieces of text together to then generate a new generation, a new inference from previous known facts. That stuff AI cannot do. Like it's going to take you as an active reader and writer to do that. So for example, how do X and Y relate? That'd be an example to drive questions. What if X was Y? So another mode. How can I do X while Y? So these are different questions dealing with basically constraint affordances, a metaphorical mode of thinking. What if X was Y? Or what is the relationship between X and Y? So one establishes, the big top one establishes, is there a link between these two? Are they similar or are they different? If so, how? The second question, what if X was Y, is a more analogous metaphorical thinking. It's like, what if capital is liquid, for example? How would that play out? What would be the consequences if that was the case? And then finally, how can I do X while Y means, how can I achieve some outcome with a constraint, with some reality, some affording constraint? How can I achieve some outcome? How, for example, how can we have meaning relationships if we have online dating? For example, I'm just giving you one example. Would that be the case? So in reality, they kind of build out from this kind of questioning, active reading, writing procedure. There needs to be a kind of circular cycle relationship between text to be read, a capturing connection device operation, which can be paper or it can be something like Napkin in this case. I recommend that. Needs to be, then those need to generate a reply to a question, which then you can use things like a riff partner like pseudo write. You can also do it by the way, just talking to friends. They could do it. I would think actually it's a very similar mode to that, in my opinion, which then would generate more questions. And then you have to read more text to find that answer. So it becomes ideally a spiral cycle, not a circle, but a spiral. So ideally, you're progressing to some more understanding. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean. So from drawdowns, which is a statistical object related to finance. So this comes from when we're trading stocks or trading some equity or asset on a stock market. If there's basically a drop, when there's a loss, that's a drawdown. So it's a temporal look back against your over a period of time. When did you go from a high to a low? Well, if for people who might not know, I have an interest in reading technology and specifically how do we measure reading? So the eyes is one of the apparatus we can do that. So eye tracking, I was working on a project related to that. So by reading literature on eye tracking technology, and then I just happened to watch a video about stocks that use the term drawdown, and then I was like, huh. My mind started thinking about it because we were dealing with a problem at the time we had to solve technically. This led to one of the products we produce, which is an ADHD test. So in 90 seconds, you can find out if you have ADHD or not, because of this understanding that was not, no one said explicitly you can use drawdowns to come up with these predictions. That had to be generated by my team, the team that was working on it. And the initial spark of inspiration came from this this kind of multi-text reading and metaphorical thinking. What if we saw eye track movements as drawdowns? What would happen then? Well, the answer was we got a very powerful predictional tool out of that, for example. Another example is when I spoke with Johannes on the intersection of Aristotle and Heidegger. There was towards the end, there was kind of a question related to it because it's not very, Aristotle's super old school. So I remember saying in the text in the interview, we can't simply LARP as Aristotelians today. That's not going to work. The reason why I bring that up because I know individuals who do that. As individuals who quote Aristotle virtue ethics, but in light of obviously we're not in ancient Greece, and writers like McIntyre talking about life is basically modern society, civilization after virtue, as the moral theory of understanding of how we think about things. You can't just copy paste the past and put it in the present. So this is examples where this is more of a personal project I'm thinking about. I've been thinking about for a long time. Basically thinking questions like, what is the ontological status of the moral? What is the consequence if the intellect is not material, but rather spiritual? And what allows individuals to be generalized to a population, yet denies us the ability to conclude from populations to individuals? So these are the kinds of questions I'm asking that are going to require I have questions. I'm going to have to read text. They're going to need to be captured and connected. And they need to generate an answer reply. And then I need to riff on that in a community of some kind. And things like AI, like pseudo-write could help me with this along the way. That will generate more questions and repeat, etc. So to kind of close it out, the better reading with AI tools comes down to fundamentally this principle. We need to be an active reader, which actually requires a deep relationship to writing. So while you're reading, you must write. They have to work together. And AI tools can help you build out the network relationships of your reading and writing when you structure it around questions to be answered. And from those answers arranged in a composition to connect with other people, to have a dialogue of where you share that, and then you actively listen now to see where your gaps, what are you missing, what are you misunderstanding, what things need to be addressed. This generates new questions, which then leads the pursuit more forward. So that would be my short answer, that AI can help you in I believe very reasonably it can help you with the capture connect side of the equation, as well as the riffing dialogue side. It is possible. I think it is very possible to do that. So I hope this has been fun. It's been insightful. It's still thinking about this idea, but I hope this was useful. And that's all for me.
Should I stop the recording, Thomas, or do you want to
Yeah.
go into like a discussion?
Actually, yeah, we can do a discussion. We can roll. That's fine.
Okay. Um, yeah, man, I really enjoyed this presentation, honestly. Uh, I wanna add as a side comment that I don't think you were overstepping your definition of literacy. Um, Mainly because I'm in college right now, and apparently their definition of literacy is not only just speaking and writing, but basically just a really general, how do we use language? How do we, um, so I think your example of boxing was actually probably the most prime example of like how literacy does not just apply to the physicality of just reading and writing, but there is an actual real literacy between boxing, any cultural activity that we do. There's always a kind of literacy going on. So yeah, I honestly think your example of boxing was actually brilliant. It really exemplified like how there is a kind of literacy going on. Um, Even when you look at boxing, like I may be literate in philosophy, but I'm going to be completely illiterate in boxing, right? Because I don't know that language at all. And so I think the way that definition is expanding is like it seems to be more like a spectrum of like in a given context and situation, there's points where I'm completely illiterate, you know? So yeah. Um, hmm. I think your points on note taking was good. I think personally I always struggle with coming up with the question because I'm not sure exactly what I want to ask. And I think what I want to ask you is, in your experience, is it better to um, kind of like look at the title and kind of like pre determine a question, or is it better to sort of just like as you read along and be like, huh, give a question as that occurs. Um, yeah,
Yeah, no, that's great points. I think actually the first point to pick up is if power of summarizing. So if you can't summarize the text, you're gonna find out very quickly you don't understand it. So that would actually be my first answer. If there's absolutely no imperatives and to read the text, you're doing for your own purposes, and there's no question at the beginning to start. When you read and do a summary, if you notice that, I promise you, because I've done that too. Like I've then tried to summarize text and go, oh shit, I don't know. And then there you go. Now you just got your first question, the answer, which is I don't know something. And that's good. And actually it's good. Like it's actually a good thing. You're like, yes, I don't know something. That'd be one example. The other one is actually a big one is surprise. That's a huge one. One of my favorite examples, one of my favorite definitions of information is surprise, meaning um, Shannon Claude talked about this. It's in statistics, so in information and basically in computer science and statistics. Um, so the idea is because think about it, when something's already known to you, it's new. It's not new information. It's as if it never. It's as if it doesn't exist because it's just like yeah, I know that. But then when you have an expectation, and then your expectation gets violated, I thought the floor was there. The floor disappeared. Whoops. Now I knew information that matters a lot, for example. So that would be that the kind of surprise that comes from an expectation being violated would generate a question. Why was I wrong? That would be another way to think about that. So summary and so basic what when you have expectations violated. Um, I think I'm trying to think of an example for a expectation violator recently I read. Um, oh, actually, recently. So one of my projects I'm interested in is the development of friendship for men. So and basically, it's funny, ironically, that in men, one mode that masculinity has basically been devoided, lost. It's as if friendships in void of masculinity, like the complete contrary. Yet friendship is actually a whole section in the Aristotle's ethics. It's very clearly known that the friendship is such a core aspect of the moral life, and especially the political life. And quite frankly, the normative attitude was that the political space was for men. So thus, it would seem very reasonable for men to have friendships in ancient Greece. But today it's very lost. So anyway, I bring that up because recently I got a surprise, a statistic that if you have a friendship that lasts for over 7 years, the likelihood that it has a 90% success rate of enduring for all your life. So it's almost like, because we have this kind of assumption that everything in life is so brittle and friendship and transitory, and yeah, your friend relationships of work and school will just go away. But if you have something that lasts for over 7 years, it's almost as if like that's like a benchmark. Like I didn't expect that. That would be an example. How valid is that statistic? I don't know. But the point is that surprised me because I had an expectation that was violated. Now I have a question. Where's that source? What were the conditions? Does that apply? I vote now this generation in question. So anyways, so yeah, that would be my answer.
Thomas, thanks for the presentation. I had a question for you. Can you hear me?
Michelle, we can't hear you. You lost your mic.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Nope.
Oh, that's weird because I can hear.
You were speaking before.
That's really weird because I can hear.
Oh.
Thomas, are you saying you can't hear her? Because I could hear her.
Oh, wait. I think it might be me. Hold on a second. Here, try again.
Can you hear me now?
Now I can. It was me. I'm sorry.
Okay. No worries. I just said thank you for the presentation. And I had a question for you about, well, first of all, I think that particularly Napkin, I thought that was such a neat name for that. It's funny because just very recently, I was like at this food court with the kids, and this mom, well, I didn't know she was a mom at the time, but she could have been a mom, and she passed me a little note on a napkin, like when she went to go. It was so sweet and so encouraging. But the point of the matter is I often am writing on little things like napkins, or, well, not napkins. I don't have napkins, mostly paper towels. But the point of the matter is like Post-it notes, whatever, all these little things. But I think that I like that idea of like it being more organized, because just this morning I was thinking about like this thing that I had read recently, but I couldn't exactly remember where it was from. I was like, I think it's either, and I have two sources so I can go back to them and check, and hopefully I'll find it. And maybe I'll find some other stuff while I'm there. But I think that that's something that I do that seems to be particularly useful about these tools, AI tools, is like organization. Kind of can keep things like all in one place. So I think that's a really neat idea. And I think the idea of like engaging with the text itself being like more able to have it be something you can understand. And like, I guess what the big thing for me that is standing out to me right now as after you've shared is this idea that it's actually this interplay between what we don't know and what we know, and the surprise, like you're saying, there's surprise questions, the scrambled up expectations that then actually are a part of us being able to learn better. It's like it has to be this constant, like, yes, obviously it's like, well, you don't know this and you're going to learn, but it's like the surprise element that's constant. You kind of fall back into the unknown and the known and the unknown and the known, that then ends up being like a greater solidification of learning itself. So anyways, those are some thoughts that came to mind. But a question for you is, what do you think is like the greatest, obviously you've displayed the benefits, and there seem to be a lot here. What could be the potential risk for using AI tools versus like just oral tradition or communication with one another?
Yeah, I would say, let's see. Well, probably the first thing is, I think how is it this way? Well, one is big part is that if you're just relying on, I didn't talk about that much in this talk, but the idea is for most people, they're not going to primary texts, right? They're not going to Aristotle. They're not going to Descartes. They're not going to Hegel. They're going to get things like 3 levels powers through kind of Twitter or YouTube, for example, or some other kind of secondary sourcing. And those are derived by algorithms. So those algorithms basically cause feedback loops. They're going to serve you what you already want. So basically what ends up happening is that your information access becomes things you already know. So you just basically get feedback loops of self-confirmation. And in fact, for most people, their interactions with information is actually the purpose of self-confirmation, which means not knowing. So that would basically be the trap. The trap is if you don't actively identify that you're an idiot, that you don't know things, you will. And actually, I'm smart. I have more confirmation. I'm correct in my beliefs. That basically the trap is that you get by no one's intention. It's just things going as they are designed to do. You're going to get stuck in a feedback loop where you are the feedback loop to yourself. So I think if you don't have a very strong hunting of disconfirmation and misunderstanding of yourself by acting questions like asking, I want you to summarize this point. And if you can't summarize it, you don't understand it. That'll be my short answer, is that even these apparatus I'm presenting, that's still the problem, because you could still do that. Like they're not going to it's not like these algorithms are going to tell you you're wrong for what you're writing. It's not going to work that way. They're just going to connect. They're just going to say, okay, cool. You said X. Cool. Now you said Y somewhere else. And they're just going to build the networks for you that just self-confirm what you said. So you don't have a course correction except for yourself ultimately. And especially related to that, because one of the values of oral culture, especially, Michelle, is that when we discourse, we have colleagues who could challenge us. So when you don't have a challenger, and I'm not going to count the discourse online as challenging, because that's not the case. It gets stuck in a weird polemic kind of meme space dynamic. So it doesn't even work. It just actually reinforces the confirmation of the other position, of your position, against when this kind of trolling episode happens online. Because you're not coming in as equals in dialogue with the purpose of understanding something. So that was kind of meditating on those points. That'd be my answer.
That's great. Thank you, Thomas.
Welcome. Cool. Yeah, that's fun. Yeah. So again, Javier, thank you again for the opportunity. It's really been, I had a fun chance to talk about this, and I'm glad you two really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Javier.
Yeah, no, I'm really appreciative that Thomas decided to do this. It's lining up perfectly because I have homework to do, and I gotta read a bunch of pages. So I'm like, cool. Thomas just showed me how to read.
Yeah.
Just lining up.
Like seriously, seriously, let me show you how many of these papers I do manually. Like this is what I do manually. Like this is those printouts, and I do the fold outs like that style. So yeah, like here's one stack of it, and then whoop. It works great. It's amazing. And actually, by the way, this is actually one of the tips for people with ADHD. This is one of the things you do to help them, is by asking questions, it focuses your attention. So, and that allows for your executive function to target in. Because people with ADHD, it's not like they don't have it's not like they don't have attention. They totally do. It's just that they don't know how. It's in their ability to control it is what's variable. So by asking questions, it focuses your attention. So it's basically almost like it's like the handicap rail. It's like the handicap ramp on sidewalks where everyone benefits from it, but it helps certain people especially to get access to something they couldn't do otherwise. So yes, I highly test it, especially why sometimes the paper method works best is because it is material. It's forcing you to be discreet about it. And it kind of like forces you to kind of see a consequence with it. So yeah, I'm very big proponent of this method. I think it works really great.
Is there a name for the method? Sorry, you probably said it, but is there a name for the method, Thomas?
Not really. There's no name per se. It's just just answer questions. It's kind of vague. Yeah, the literature is very vague about it. No one's come up with a pithy term for it yet.
It's kind of like the Socratic method while you're reading, kind of with yourself, kind of.
Yeah, kind of, but it's not really like you're not answering questions. Like that would be absolutely true for asking what is X. Like you're asking for this kind of definitional statements, and then you gotta parse it out. Actually, the one book I am reading recently is called The Second Brain. He does have code words for these methods. He took most of the literature I'm quoting from and re-summarizing it. So the amazing maps on. So he has a bunch of catchphrases he does, like para and code, for example. They basically are referring to the same things I'm talking about. But I don't have there's not like a set name to this.
So it wouldn't be like as much definitional questions, but but more so questions that are related to like the progression of thought. Like is that how would you kind of say like what distinguishes these types of questions from questions in like more of a Socratic dialogue?
Very good. I think the first part is, and this was from Adler's, the book on how to read a book. One is just the structural review. So you have to basically reconstruct the structure of the text presented to you. Then you got to build the connections inside the text. What are the key words and how do they relate? So that's actually the closest to the Socratic method. So what's energy? in physics versus if you're reading a piece of text in Aristotle when he's in Aegeia versus the New Testament when we see energy being used there. So that would be the word, and then seeing it how it relates to other parts. That would definitely that's actually the closest to a Socratic method. And then the next part is your judgment. So then your judgment on that. So it's basically, does this work or not? Do you agree or not? What's missing? But actually, so that's still like within one text. You then have to, what's actually going on is then you have to go, the higher levels of this is then to take multiple texts from different either, and then see them in dialectical either comparison, right? So it's more like, it's not a Socratic method, it's more Aristotelian historicism, where, in the beginning of the metaphysics, he gives the account of, well, we heard this account, and we heard this, and then we heard this. So that's kind of side comparisons. And then finally, the more advanced ones is because asking questions, not only, how does X and Y relate? Then it's the question of, what if X is Y? So this kind of metaphorical thinking. And then finally, how can you do X while Y? So that is, under constraints, how can you achieve some outcome or how can something be the case with X with a constraint? So for example, like just on topics I'm interested in, because the thing is because that's the thing is it's actually a little more advanced, and it's not like a Socratic method, because it's saying, what's dignity if there's no substance, for example. So if we go down Heidegger arguments or other things, actually that's my thing with my essay in Johannes's class. Basically Heidegger at one point making very clear there are no substances, at least not the Aristotelian way of substance. That's definitely not the case. But then he seems to be saying there needs to be this kind of protection against the onslaught of technology. And then I'm left with the question. I'm literally asked with the question. I'm like, well, why? Why you seem to be calling this imperative like this matters, like as if there's something being violated, something being changed, like approached, strangled, attacked. But if you're saying there's nothing there to attack in the first place, why are you even making an issue in the first place? That'd be an example. So it's basically saying, it's putting a conditional thought that, how can you have this thing called dignity, basically a kind of opening, protection, when you don't care about if there's no substance, if there's no kind of predicate, no necessity predicate to guarantee that actually explains dignity, at least one mapping of it. Does that make sense? This way of fleshing it out.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for fleshing that out. It kind of makes me think that, questions and this sort of the why, like why is it like that? Why is important. And I wonder, and like this would be like a whole nother can of worms, but I wonder sometimes with education, the way it's done traditionally, it's often like, well, here are the questions, here's the questions. And it's also like, if you do give a lot of whys, it can be seen as like subversive, or like, why are you asking so much about that? Just if we think about just traditional classroom structures. And so I wonder, a lot like these tools and just the general method and idea of questioning while reading is so important, but it's almost like you also have to want to ask questions, right? Like you have to, the curiosity seems to be integral in actually learning itself. And I wonder if sometimes the challenge is to get people back to a place of like feeling almost safe in their questioning, like that it's okay to ask, that you can ask, and also to be able to oh my gosh, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, the idea, the ability to be able to ask the whys, and then also want to ask. And so, yeah, I mean, I think wanting to ask and all of that, like, I'm not sure. I wonder, like, I'm not sure AI can do the want part for people, right? Like getting them to want to be curious and want to be asking questions. But we do this innately. We just sometimes like, that's right. We're given the questions, and then, you get the question. So you have to solve for the answer, solve for the problem, right? Or we ask questions. And I mean, I've had this happen too, like where you ask a question and it's just like, it's received as subversive, or like as if you're trying to just be difficult, And so I wonder if that can sometimes become an impediment for being able to be an active reader, or, because of just sort of these, like, I don't know if this is, I don't know, getting into like the psychological realm.
Michelle,
yeah.
no, you're totally correct. I mean, part of the reason why the reading stats are so bad is because it's the standard we're trying to hold students to is recall. Literally repeat what's been said. So there is no new generation. There's no generating of new knowledge. It's just recall. And by the way, this goes on all the way to PhD. Like in the structure of academics, the individuals who get to create new knowledge is PhDs. Everybody else from down the chain is just different acts of information recall, of its more advanced different degrees of recall. That's generally how it goes. So that's a completely true statement, what you're saying. Like, like most people, what's the incentive? The incentive is if you have projects. I think that's the answer.
Exactly.
You have to have projects. Like, and actually that's
absolutely. Yeah.
I think actually
you have your own. Oh, sorry.
No, just to close. Like, I think actually the beginnings of this starts in how questions. I think how is actually the beginning. And then it becomes why. Because you got to ask the question, well, how does that work? Like, how does this happen? Or so how is a kind of it's like beginning, especially in your projects where you're trying to achieve an outcome and you have to gain certain knowledge. You have to answer questions to answer those questions, the how question. Eventually, through a repetition of that, you're going to end up in why questions, because eventually how questions lead to why questions eventually, if you keep pursuing them long enough. So that'd be my answer. At least, I mean, that was my journey into philosophy, was from that. It was all how questions originally. Trust me, it was all how. And then the hows became a why, because you want to know the principle about why something is happening.
That's good. That's good. Well, I think that's why it's great to be able to have a dialect with just traditional institutions and learning, because you can utilize that with your own projects and your own intrinsic motivations to really use that as a source then to get dialectical with, and to find a good place of kind of just raw material by which to start to play with these types of questions, and the hows and then the whys and all of that. So yeah, thank you for answering my questions.
No, of course. No, again, and it's actually see this, by the way, like notice this, like just as look at this meta context of discourse and question and of the conversation, right? These are things that an AI could not give you, because they're surprising, and they are drawing out areas that you had questions, and there are uncertainties and things I didn't even, like, by you asking the question and me answering, we have new understanding, right? We have things fleshed out that were not there before. So it basically goes to show that there's a depth, like, we need human beings. Basically, we're not going anywhere. It's just that if our job is just to just regurgitate information and reproduce it, it's not going to do, like, that's not it. It's the next step beyond that matters. So it's been fun. It's been a great session so far. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, just to add a little bit, I think, I'm like inferring a lot here, but I think, obviously taking this like notion of literacy, like, and expanding it, like, for example, when Heidegger says like language is the house of being, right? You really see like the importance of literacy kind of beyond the context of like reading and writing, where but also included, where you understand that things sort of cover themselves and unveil themselves in comparison to the questions that you're asking. So like Heidegger, he's the one that basically famously said, right, like the question is also the answer at the same time. Like the answer is already contained within the question. And so there's constant veiling and unveilings going on. And it's funny because I didn't make those connections, so I started taking this English class, and I was like, I started realizing like there is something really deeply ontological, like, about being literate, and about how the world like functions and how just things unveil. And even though we are in the midst of language and in language and so on, there is, you could say, the only way to combat being in language is by actually trying to be literate, and things just sort of open up for you or close for you. Yeah, so I thought all that stuff was great. And I think Again, I really love the boxer example, man. Really love the boxer example. The dancing. I mean, to me, I really saw the languages when you compare the two, right? You had Muhammad Ali, you had what was his name? Mayweather, and then I think another boxer I didn't know. But yeah, just like the moves and that individual responding, which is very important. I think that's the thing that school doesn't get at too much is how do you come up with your own particularity for responding? I think because I think what happens is they ask a question and every student kind of gives like almost the same answer basically. But when we're talking about like, for example, actually, I think my Japanese uh, Buddhism in Japan class is actually a very good example of what my teacher's doing. He says that we have to summarize a text that we found interesting, a section of the reading that we found interesting, and then we have to sort of present a question that came up from that summarization of the particular area that we found interesting. And so I thought it was very beautiful the way you explained, how we should look at reading and annotating, because I think the way my professor is setting it up for us is that one, it engages like our interest, right? Whatever part that I found interesting, I summarize it and then I come up with a question. And then what we do at the end of class is he starts presenting all of our questions and then we just talk about it, right? Which now that I think about it, is actually a very sort of brilliant move to sort of like engage our thinking about like how, Japan and Buddhism and so on. Yeah. Wonderful talk. I loved it.
That's excellent. That's a great professor. That's a very smart move. Very good. All right, cool. Javi, yeah, you're still host, so you can cut the recording.
Okay. All right. All right.
Thanks,
That's
guys.
good.